Okay, and here we go.
Chaim.
Oh, thanks. I'd just like to make one public service announcement. I think, and it's not because I happen to give the last 2 chaburas, but I think people should make more of an effort to give chaburas this year. I think it's an important thing for being mavar ideas that you're thinking about and ideas that are constantly going about in your heart. The only way to bring them out into the world is to give a chabura, and the only way to clarify them is to give a chabura. And if you haven't given one, you should make it your business to give one. If you've given one, you should make your business to give 2. I'm only speaking from experience. For like a year, I was always like, oh, well, I give a chabura. I never did. And since I've started to give every here and there, I've just felt it's helped a lot in terms of other areas of both learning, living, helping to like clarify purpose and goal in the world. So I would suggest that if you have an idea that you're thinking about, turn it into a chabura, come and speak about it, and we'll be here. There's good masha and good food, so we'll be here anyways.
Chaim.
So the impetus for this chabura was actually kind of I gave a share in Livingston over Shabbos Bereshis. So it's the same kind of cliff that we'll be jumping off, but it's a little deeper, it's a little more intense, a little more radical than the share in Livingston. But it all comes from the same place and the same nakuda of trying to harmonize our life and live a life where we just feel like we're being ourselves yet fulfilling the will of God. Because sometimes those two things in our own lives seem to contradict, and we feel like we have to choose one. And once we get into the business of choosing one, regardless of the choice we make, a lot of times we feel like we made the wrong choice. So that's anything I give over, it's just that nakuda of trying to clarify that. So the first source is actually just the actual source of the floating ship. It's the Rambam Shmona Prakim, where he talks about the chelek hamadame, the part of the brain that's the part of the nefesh, really. That's the imaginative part of it, the imagination. And he basically says, chelek hamadame hu hakoach hashomer es rishme. This is going to come back in a later source, but I just wanted to, it's also the Teva, and it's also the Star Wars and Star Trek, and everything that has a flying ship. It's everything. But it's chelek hamadame hu hakoach hashomer es rishme hamoichashois acharei shene'lamo min hamaga hayashir machushim asher sigosam hu marchivosam zeh b'zeh mafrirosam zeh b'zeh. So basically, imagination allows for 2 contradicting things, 2 things that are separate to come together as one. L'chein marchiv koach zeh dvarim shehu hisig es im dvarim asher otam lo hisig klal yeshiyah shar la'sigim. It seems things that seem that it's impossible for them to be reached together. Kigon sheidame adam sfinas barzel haveres baver. For example, a person who imagines a iron ship passing in the sky. So the actual Micah made a point when I told him about this. Micah Gordon.
Where is he?
That's a good question. I think he has class.
Right.
He said that we have planes now. Planes are like the iron ship that floats in the sky. So it's pretty. At the end, we'll see that it's a good litmus test of where we are in terms of messianic advent. That iron ships are flying in the sky, floating in the sky means we're on the doorstep. After, and we'll see that as we get through this year. So, Noah, when he goes to the Teva, he says, the Torah says, Vayavo pasuk zayin, Vayavo Noach ubana v'ishto u'neshei bana v'yitel ha'teva mipnei me'amal. That Noah came to the Teva with his family, mipnei me'amal, because of the waters of the Mabul. So Rashi points out, mipnei me'amabul, af Noach mikatnei amanahaya. Even Noach was lacking in Amunah. He was one of the small, faithful people of the generation. Mamin ve'eno mamin, he believed and he didn't believe. At the same time, sheyavo hamabul, that the Mabul would come. V'lo nichnas l'teva ad she'dachkuhu hamayim. He didn't enter the Teva until the water started coming down pretty heavy. It's interesting that Rashi, we know Noah is, not to get into, who says what about tzaddik, that he was a tzaddik in his generation or, even in other generations, but, Noah was a tzaddik who went in the ways of God, and even says that, the pasuk, 2 pasuk before him, it says, Vayas Noach, Kechol asher tziva Hashem, and Rashi points out also that he did what Hashem told him. So, what's Rashi telling us? What does it mean for us that Noach was mekatnei amana and that he believed and he didn't believe? If he did all that Hashem told him, so he clearly believed in the word of God, he clearly did it. So what's Rashi telling us that Dafka, when he was a mamin and an eno mamin, he went into the table. So that's going to be what we're going to explore tonight. Why that comment of Rashi, of mamin and eno mamin. And what it means for us, because I was reading in Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg's book on Bereshit, she mentioned in her Hakdama that when a person learns Torah, and they learn Mefarshim on the Torah, and when they learn other things, secular sources or whatever, you need to put it back into learn the new stuff and then reread the Torah in that new light. Because the Torah is what's driving our life. So we need to understand what the Torah's message is for us. So tonight's Chabura, and really all of them, but is really exploring this comment of Rashi to understand the significance of Vayavo Noach mipnei me'amabul. Why it was so significant that Noach came when the water started to come. Mipnei amabul, that he was a mamin and eno. So a bunch of psukim later, it says that the Mabul affected kol asher nishmas ruach. The Mabul affected everything that had a nishmas ruach chayim, everything that had the life force, as Rashi points out, the neshima. And we know that when you hear that, you go back to Bereshit and you think, when man was created, how did God create him? He formed him from the dust of the earth, and then he blew into him a breath of life. So, by the Torah mentioning to us that the Mabul came to kind of flip everything on its head, and to basically get rid of the nishmas chayim that man was created with, it must be that there's a message for us going back to creation, especially the creation of man, that the Mabul, and specifically the Teva guarding us in the Mabul, is teaching us a lesson that we had not yet learned, that Noah learned then. He was the only one in his generation to really learn it. Creation, we know, is filled with paradox. Everything in creation is a paradox. There's, just the fact that God constricted his oneness in order for the world to be for things to be created, means that it's rooted in creation. There's a paradox. There's opposites happening. The notion of a unity and the notion of separateness. What Aviva Gottlieb calls primal disintegrations. And sounds like someone's being strangled, like they're flying in the air, It sounds like a cartoon character flying in the air like in a Pixar movie or something.
Oh.
Fine. It's a little man in the film.
You in the box.
He's in the freezer.
So we're going to leave Noah and the Mabul and his actions alone for a second, and I want to go back to creation to begin to just understand, kind of build a foundation of what was happening and what Noah was experiencing and what he did that was reigniting the flame of creation and the purpose of creation, our purpose here. So beginning with, obviously the notion that one of the first things God did was creation's filled with the idea of havdalah, of separating. Meaning taking one thing and making it into two things that are now no longer together. They are two separate things, two sometimes go together, sometimes don't go together. But it's specifically with the creation of man that that God does his most audacious thing yet to be done. And pick up source 3. It says the role of the angels to suggest. Basically, God asked the angels, let's create man. Why does God need to do that? In order to teach humility to them. So the role of the angels is to suggest a manyness of viewpoints, a spectrum of opinions that God has to convince, placate, ultimately to receive permission. And what is God's main argument in favor of creating humankind in Rashi's version? He said to the angels, you exist in the upper worlds after my likeness. If there is to be no one in the lower worlds after my likeness, then there will be jealousy among the works of the beginning. In other words, God desires a proliferation of his image in lower as well as upper worlds, a mitigation of his oneness, even in the sense of his greatness. God, as it were, submits, nimlach, in the passive form of the verb to be king, to rule, his greatness and seeks permission from those smaller than him. This imagery of consultation and proliferation is employed, as Rashi notes, even though its associations are obviously disconcerting to a monotheistic theology, despite the unwelcome resonance from the discussions and disputations that accompany creation in pagan mythologies. The Torah uses a plural verb to communicate a moral teaching. In spite of the license given to heretics by this formulation, the text does not restrain itself from teaching the virtue of humility. The great one should consult with, request permission from the small one. For if the text had said, "Let me make man," we would not have learned that he spoke with his angelic corp and merely with himself. In this next paragraph, I thought I was going crazy when I read it. The text, then, according to Rashi, risks heretical interpretation in order to make a point of vital importance for human life. The point has to do with the one, the great one, who begins on day one, alone in the upper worlds, and then engages in an activity that apparently compromises his oneness and his greatness. God himself committed, it's so crazy to even say it, committed an act of heresy. In order for man to exist down below, in order for that creation, for order him to do something with that notion of there was oneness, and I myself am, quote unquote, ruining that oneness in order for you to exist. So God is implanting in man, which we'll see further, this notion of him separating one into many. From the
the idea of Simpson was also sort of, he constricted himself. He went the opposite of what Ein Sof is about.
Yeah, that's what she's talking about.
That's what she's talking about.
Meaning, the act of creation is in itself a heretical notion, but God himself did it, which is on top of the notion that the act is also crazy. From a Midrash perspective, it seems that Havdalah, separation, specialization, the formation of difference and opposition, is generally achieved at some sacrifice. When, for instance, the lower waters are separated from the higher waters on the second day of creation, the lowers are described. So, embedded in creation is this notion of what we call the doctrine of opposites. I don't know if that's a statement, but that's what we'll call it for here. meaning the idea that opposites can exist now. Before that, there was oneness. There was just one light. Everything was within that light, and there wasn't other. There was no, as Reb Wholesome, he explains the Tanya, he says, most people hear oneness and they think, oh, okay, oneness, two-ness. Oneness is a much deeper unity that even if you split it, quote unquote, it doesn't split. Something that's one.
Light and dark, or what?
Yes.
Like kind of like water.
Well, meaning, yeah, even if you split it, it like searches for its way back to. We're touching on before everything was one, and then the creation of the world. So now things exist in its opposite form. There's light and there's dark, and there's dry and there's wet, and there's and there's opposites.
But it's something that doesn't exist now, so we can't understand what it would
What do you
be
mean?
to be totally one.
We can't understand it either.
Exactly.
We can't understand it.
Can?
That's the essence. We can't understand it.
We can or cannot.
We cannot.
Yeah, exactly.
It's impossible for the human mind, the intellectual human mind, I mean, at least for me, to comprehend
what that would
oneness.
be.
Because
you can get that it would be something else.
The point Reb was making is that we think oneness, we automatically think, okay, it's oneness until it's split into two. But it's much deeper than, oh, it can't be split. It's like the. But I don't want to focus on this is just a pass. This is a stop in the station. Moving on. We know that in creation, man and woman were created. As Rashi says, du partsufim, two faces, and they're split. And then ultimately, in order for them to split, they were split, and they became Adam and they became Chava. They became man and woman. And pick up source 5, which says in chapter 2, it's stating the kind of the creation of man, but now it's woman's being created, and it says Vayipal Hashem Elokim Tardema, and God caused the sleep to fall over man, which Rashi actually says man himself fell asleep. Even though God caused it, man himself went to sleep. Ala Adam vayishan, and he slept. Vayikach achas mitzalasa vayisgor basar tachtena. And Rashi says vayasgor makom hachadoch. God closed up his surgery that he performed on man. He made it as if like man would never know the point where Chava came from. Why? Shelo yira chaticha chabasar, so that he wouldn't see the place where she came from, the rib, the piece of flesh. Shemimenu nivras v'titvaze alav, and become disgusted over it. So God concealed in order for man and woman to come together and create a unity between them.
So the second time.
So we see that he. What do you mean the second time?
You say he concealed it and created man.
Yeah, he concealed himself. So that was A. And then he concealed, and he did it for man to teach man the lesson that this notion of concealment in order to, his rachakus, to get to his karmos.
Why do you think that man would be Tizvazel?
Because he would see.
He was asleep, somebody stole something from him or something?
No, I saw it as that he would know that the disgust comes by knowing that that's the same as me.
And like
that's not different. So if you want to, you can get incestual if you want. You can get in the sense that he's related, he's having relations with himself, or you could also get that this notion that there's some excitement about something being different and unifying with something that's different. Whereas, oh, that's me. Nah, I don't need to deal with that.
Everything he was seeing came directly from God.
Yeah.
So if it came from him, he would see it as less
That's cool.
So, well, all this within this world of creation, these paradoxes are existing of opposites, and opposites ultimately attracting. This notion that, as the Rambam was saying, that an existence of opposites going on as one happened for man. For God, he could do the act. It's God. He doesn't need certain types of realities or existences for it to happen. He's God. He's Almighty. But for man, the first place it happens is in a tardema, in a deep sleep. Which a tardema is a trade nemai, is it's such a deep sleep that even when you wake up, you're not sure if you've woken up from a dream or you're just waking up within the dream, but you're still in the dream. And this notion that opposites coming together, because ultimately man, lo matzah is a connecto, happened, get together. Happens in a tardema. So that's A. Creation, opposites in creation. God, embedded in creation is this notion, but especially for man, in order for woman to be created, who's his opposite, his Ezer Kenegdo, the Israel says the Ezer Kenegdo is the mom is your opposite. Oh, someone who fights you. It's not like, it's not the way we understand soulmate. It's like your mortal enemy.
Because the Vara are like the good within you. Yeah.
So in order for that to happen, it had to happen b'tardema, in sleep. So it had to happen for man, for Adam, first man, in sleep. Moving on to page 2, brisbane of Basarim. It says pasuk Yud Beis, Vayhi Hashemesh Lavo. When the sun came or set, the tardema nafla, and a deep sleep fell upon Avram Avinu. V'hinei ema chashecha, gedola nofel slav. Okay. Ayomer Avram yeda teda ki geriv zaracha beretz lo lahem v'adum v'inu osam arba me'eshana v'gam asagoy asher yadu dam anochi v'achrechein yatzu b'chushkad. So basically, God is basically transferring the goal, the purpose of humanity onto the Jewish people. Before it was like human consciousness was X, and now the Jews have a special, Avram Avinu. Really, the Abrahamic faiths have it. From here, brisbane of Basarim. Seal and covenant between the pots. And what happens? Again, God puts Avram to sleep, deep sleep. And what does he tell him about? He tells him about you'll be a stranger in a strange land. Rashi has to point out for us that it's Mitzrayim. But the Torah is making a specific point by not mentioning, even if it's so clear to us what the Torah is talking about, by not mentioning Mitzrayim. Even though Mitzrayim, we'll see why that's important, but you're going to be a stranger in a strange land. Man in this world is a stranger in a strange land. This is not where we're supposed to be. We're chelek elokim mimal. Being down here means that we're in a strange land. We're a strange body, but God is sealing the covenant with the Jewish people at this point in a tardema, in a sleep, in a deep sleep. And the one thing he decides to tell him before he wakes him up is, you're going to be strangers in a strange land, slaves, and you'll come over with a chushkado. If you're trying to, make a bris with someone, you want positive energy. You don't want, the ultimate, suck. By the way, you're going to lose most of your people to, assimilation. You're going to, things are going to get rough. You're going to be enslaved. You're going to have, that slave mentality, almost with you forever, And God's, telling this to Avram as, the brisbane of Basarim. So, until this week, I thought it was crazy. But this week it's not, because I saw mine from Reb Adam, which we'll look at, which is, it's one of the wildest things I've ever seen. And he says, it's a source 7, and he says, where is it? Okay, let's keep it puzzle yatzas, was read from the top. Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Laman Tiskos Yom Tzitz Cham Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Kol Yemei Chayecha. The Isa b'Mishnah, Yemei Chayecha, Hayamim, Kol Yemei Chayecha, Lahavi L'Mas Mashiach. Okay, behind the Digam Yaskiru Inyan Yitzias Mitzrayim, V'Zchiras Gulas Mitzrayim, Hu Davar Muchla, Kamuvan Me Omer Laman Tizkor, Shehu Kemazir, V'Omer Asher Lo Tishchach, Al Davar Zeh V'Tizkor Oso. Okay, the Halo Zchiras Agula Shayach, Rak to Eis HaShibud, that remembering the Gula is Shayach only in a time of Shibud. The Be'ez HaGolus v'Hashibud Hine Az Maskir Inyan HaGula L'Shtei Apana. Aleph. So there's in the time of Golus and Shibud and enslavement. So we remember Geula in 2 ways. Here it is. Ha'aleph Lahalel L'Shabeach Es L'Hashem Yisbarach Al Ha'avar Asher Ga'alnu V'Galas Avosenu. To praise God, to bless God, on the past for redeeming our, for redeeming us. V'chal zeh hu hashevach v'ahil Hashem yisbach al kol yisinin hagula me'avodas habirrurim v'galus v'shibud. And for just the avoda of galus, of like birrurim, of galus and shibud. Praise him like, okay, galus it was really tough, but in Gula you like look back on galus and you're like, okay, a lot of like birrurim happened that like looking back on it, and if you, I don't want to make a general statement, but the Jewish people have always been the people who get crapped on, but then afterwards look back and like are mevarer their gullus to such a degree that they create such a geula wherever they go. Look at any gullus, any shibud in Jewish history. There's a tremendous geula that comes after it. Why? Because the Jewish people, their avoda is birrurim. So they take a gullus and they say, okay, we were in gullus, we were exiled. Why were we there? Let's make it better now. Look at any other people in the world who are still, fighting for their freedom, but like never win their freedom because they don't understand that it wasn't given to them. And they refuse to learn this notion of birrurim, this avodas hagolus of birrurim. It's a broad concept, but it's clarifying purpose, clarifying the good from the bad, like taking the good out of the bad. And if only the people of the world would say, personal and collective would say, exile, personal and collective, is about birrurim, the world would be redeemed. It wouldn't be closer, it would be redeemed, because that's what Gullus does. But we praise Hashem for the Gula. Why? This is where it is. The Zeo Perish Maimer Haggadah Baruch Hu Shakadosh Baruch Hu Chishev Es Kates Lasos. Blessed is God for calculating the end of exile. Why? Vakavana Bazeh Hu Dihine Nisav Hakadosh Baruch Hu Lioslo Yisbara Dir Betachtonim. God desires for us. The purpose of creation was to make a dir b'tachtonim for Him down below, to reveal godliness in this world, creating a dwelling place for Him and for His name, and for Him and for His presence in this world. Al yidei avodas habirrurim shel tachtonim. Through the birrurim, through living a life of good and bad mixed together, and making a birrurim down here in this world, is so desirable to God. God has such delight in this avodah. So we would think, it would cross our mind that it's so pleasurable to God that He doesn't want Gullus to end. Why would He want Gullus to end? It's more pleasurable to Him than us sitting and being mevatel to His light. More pleasurable than that is being down here below, living a life of tov ra b'erbuvia, and being mevarer the good from the bad. at every stage of our life, not just in the big moments, but in the little moments. And that's so joyous, that's so delightful to him, whatever that even means, that we would think that he wouldn't end Gullus. Because it's so good. So we bless him for ending Gullus. Hine zeh hashevach. This is the shevach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, going back to the original creation of God, where he kind of did what was against himself. He took what was most enjoyable to him and he said, there's going to be an end. There's going to be a case. Even though this is me, I'm ending it. So that's the praise of God. It's the praise from the creation of the world, of man, of that original creation, of saying, I'm removing myself from the world in order for you to be created. I'm removing my delight of this world in order for you to be redeemed. But the main point I wanted to bring out from that is the avoda of Gullus, the exile, the exile of the Jewish people that we're in now, and every single person's personal exile that they're in at any moment. Because we all know until the redemption, we kind of move from little exile to little exile in our lives, whether they're perceived or real. We move from, so yeah, there's an end, but God loves that of being in exile, being in such bad zone, and yet doing some birrurim, however small or however large we think it is, of saying, I'm choosing this today, and I'm not choosing this way. I'm choosing this way, and I'm not choosing this way. But it only can come from having the choice, from saying there's Tov and there's Ra, and there's me the sinner, and there's me the perfect, and there's me this, and there's me that, and I'm always going to choose the good. I'm always going to choose Adam Friedman, the tummy, Adam, and I'm always going to choose. And yes, so I exist in a reality of I sin and I whatever, and I don't sin, and I sin more, and I sin more, and I whatever. I don't let that affect me because this is the tachtonim, this is the down below, this is the exile, and God is rejoicing to a degree that there would be the thought that would cross our mind that He would leave us in Gullus in order for us to struggle, in order for us to feel that agmas nefesh of like I suck, but getting up the next day and marching on.
So powerful knowing that it's not like he had a person who wrote this, Reb Adam had a very, very hard life.
Yeah,
it'd be easy to say it to like for someone who
personal
had
very
hard times. Yeah,
extremely. Yeah, it means a lot more when you put it in that context as well. He had personal and collective,
physical problems. Yeah. MS. Yeah.
And the only treatment for MS back then was going to a spa in like Switzerland. I don't think there's treatment for it now, but
there's not.
But the only way they dealt with it was like go breathe the air of Marienbad. Maybe it worked. I don't know. So now I want to move into just bringing it down to ourselves. Like this is very what was happening, and that's why God specifically mentioned by the bris bein habasarim, by the covenant that He was sealing with the Jewish people, strangers in a strange land, Yitzias Mitzrayim, because ultimately, what is the covenant between us, the bris between us and God, it's not the other things. It's avodas birrurim down below in Gullus. It's the avodah, it's Gullus. That's the covenant between us and God. There was a creation, there was the moment of exile, and there's going to be the redemption. He tells us that, great. But what makes the bris between the Jewish people and God, between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, personally, especially as a group, is Gullus. Is what we do in Gullus down below. What we do here. The avodah of saying, okay, so I live what seems to me like a contradictory life, as I was saying in the beginning, where God's will seems to get in the way of Adam's my will, and my will definitely gets in the way of God's will, and making a choice, and choosing, and choosing wrong, so we choose right the next time. But to never look at ourselves and say, I chose wrong, so I'm wrong. I'm wrong. That's it. I'm done. I'm wrong. I shouldn't have been created. I shouldn't have been. That's only the end. That's like the end thought. You eventually get down to that thought, and that's like the lowest. But embedded in creation is that notion of concealing and revealing ourselves. God concealed, and Adam and Chava ultimately, even though it says that he brought Chava to Adam, he knew her. And knowing is a very deep, besides for the biblical understanding of like knowing is a very deep, the deepest understanding of someone where you're one because it's not a physical coming together. It's in the bones. In my bones, I'm you. Adam and God brought her, but Adam, by coming together, said, even though we look different, even though we seem to be contradicting, you're male, I'm female. You're me. In my bones, I know you're me. You know I'm you. And that's ultimately the Avodah of Golus is revealing that between us and God is I'm you and you're me. That's what it is. But again, don't lose the sight of the fact that both these happen in a dream. Exile is referred to as sleep, as a dream. And the reason it is because you'll see the source, you'll see here that in dreams, opposing things can exist as one. My life as a contradiction can be the reality. Is how I have to live, and that's the way that we get to Gula. And by Yaakov, he had a dream. And what did he see in his dream? Sulam mutavarta, Rosh Megia Shemaima, Olam v'Yarden. Heaven and earth bound together, up and down. Contradictions happening in his dream, and that was it. And he woke up and he said, I know this is where God is. I know this is God. I know this is where he is. That's what when he woke up, that's what he said. That's what the Torah says. He said, Amen. Those were the words that came out of his mouth. Because seeing his life not as, I made this choice and it was wrong, and I made this choice to get the bracha, and now Esau wants to kill me. But seeing his life as complicated, somewhat messed up occurrences happening to him, he's like, this is where God is found. Not in the straight, narrow, and easy, but in the thorns of God. And source 9 is from Eldis Halevi, who was the Talmud of the Alter Rebbe, with Aaron Australia. Australia. I've heard like a bunch of pronunciation. Australia, I think.
Australia.
I think it's of Stracelia, which was shortened to Australia, which basically just mumble it, say an O and an S, a PH, and an L and E, and you're good.
So he's from New Zealand?
Shrimp on the body, eh? No, it's Australia. So he explains how Golus is shared. So pick up third line down. L'chein de'isha hu yashan, in a time when a person sleeps, meaning at a time when a person's in Golus, in exile, in the narrow straits of life. Hachias hu b'chinas makif, asher kolel etzem hachias imakli benose elokim. Who machmas koach pale hamikasha gashmius ruchnius machma. It's in a level of existence where gashmius and ruchnius kind of exist together, are tied together. So therefore, it manifests in the aspect of dreaming. You're able to imagine. Davar v'hifuchu v'sham u'etes nidme lo b'chalom zman rav ki yadua ki machma shehu b'chinas ma'akif yachol lehizdamos davar shel yagia al pi chachma b'shum ofen v'gam hu b'chinas lamala me'azman lachem b'rega achad yachol lehizdamos zman rav. In a dream state, ruchnius and gashmius are able to exist together. Opposing ideas are able to exist together. Time, inception, everyone's seen it? So, like, as you go deeper and deeper and deeper, shorter times become longer times. So, this whole bending of what we perceive as reality is happening in a challah.
And you're cool with it.
And you're totally fine with it. And the one thing that really doesn't make sense is the thing that ties everything together. That's like the one thing. Until you wake up and you're like, that's the what? And the whole dream doesn't make sense because of that one thing. But in the dream, it has to be there. It's needed. I was just recently dreaming.
Tell us.
And it just didn't. I was like jumping off cliffs, but I was flying like as if I was in a wingsuit to the other side. And after like 3 times, I looked and I didn't have a wingsuit on.
Time to put your wingsuit on.
And I was just like, and I woke up and I was like trying to figure it out, and I don't know, I was stumped. I thought it was just like living on the 20th floor my whole life, recurring dream of like falling. But I couldn't figure out why it took me 3 jumps to actually check that I was wearing a wingsuit. And when I wasn't wearing a wingsuit, like I was in the dream, I was cool with it. I was like, I made it. I don't know how.
You're flying without a wingsuit.
And I was holding like, like the people with like paragliders.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a paraglider.
Only has nothing.
And I didn't know, and when I woke up, nothing made sense, but in the dream I was like, this is it. Like I made it because of these things that aren't there. It was like it was crazy. It was wild. And it all happened in like a minute. It felt like years, but it was all probably in like 30 seconds. And this is galus. Shehu b'chinas shena. Galus is b'chinas shena. Stalkus hamochin. It's the removal of the mind, the hamidos, and the emotions. Even though every soul is alive, Jewish soul is alive. Maimar Chazal. Ava pi shechata Yisrael hu ach she'eno b'hargasha s'chiyas v'kol hargasha hu mitzad etzel v'ratzon v'mizeh ikar kiyum. So he just kind of, this is like taken from, this is like an idea of the Alter Rebbe built on the Rambam, which we'll see in the next verse. But the idea that in the dream state, which is Gullus, which is Shena, the mind is removed, the emotions are removed, and the imagination remains. Well, the rest of the whole
Question.
Yeah.
So if in Galus,
okay.
if in Galus is this dream state where God is removed,
God's not removed.
you just said. It's not
Meaning, our mind,
I just implied that.
our mind, our mochin, and our midos are removed.
Are separate or removed from God.
No, are removed from our mind. When you dream, that's the reason. Alter Rebbe will explain is.
That's why.
That's why things
make sense.
That's why everything makes sense because it's straight imagination. That's why the ship's able to float in the air because your mind, your mochin is removed in the dream.
So you
meaning
that God would make more sense in Galus.
Okay, so we're getting there.
Interesting that they're both going on though, right? Because based on that logic, you would think that God would be more apparent in Galus, this dream state, because things just make more sense, right?
Our avoda is
dreaming. You don't know you're dreaming.
Our avoda is to find, is to reveal God in Galus, in this world of opposites are existing, are happening, and that you're cool with it, and you're fine with it.
Yeah.
But realizing the avoda of Galus, it's not that necessarily that we're sleeping per se, but it's Galus represents a dream, meaning within Gullus, we have the ability for living, pursuing my will and God's will can happen together. They can be one and the same.
That's in Gullus or not
It's
in
in
Gullus?
Gullus.
Like
Not outside of Gullus,
You
you can't have your will.
Ah.
You're nullified to the light of God.
There is no will.
There's no other will other than the will of God. But in Gullus, it's a crazy paradox that our Yeshus can exist with God's Yeshus.
So is, maybe I'm...
If we're getting real deep, though, we can just say that all of the wills in the world are really God. They're all coming from God.
That's what I'm saying. But in Gullus,
No,
it's
we said-
concealed.
This is God's
Concealment.
greatest pleasure,
It's our
is to
perception
watch
of-
us
In
toil.
Gullus, yeah, you're right.
You're saying
You're right.
It's, just,
In
it's,
this-
it's Nister to us. We don't know it.
Just like
Love
the Rebbe Rayatz was saying, there's an end of Gullus. Great. Praiseworthy are you for ending. Praiseworthy are you, the fact that every will, everything in the world is really summed up in you. But in Gullus, it's not the reality. That's not the revealed. That's not the perceived reality. There's concealment and there's tzimtzum and there's creation. What happened in creation? God removed himself from the world. He removed any ability to grasp his essence.
Is dreams kind of like a glimpse into our perception of dreams currently?
So but disclaimer: this isn't like a.
Dream
It's not
thing.
like dreams.
Yeah, no, okay, fine.
Dreams is like a whole. There's like a million.
Yeah, no, I know,
million
okay,
things,
fine.
but meaning it's not about. I'm not talking about our dreams, specifically. I'm just talking about the notion of
Right.
dreams.
Dreams,
Because dreams can
Okay, fine, so that's
a whole
where I was
other
going.
level of lack of understanding where it makes, where you think it makes sense.
Right, so that's-
no understanding.
So that's actually where I was definitely not saying it, but where I meant to go is with dreams, we perceive them as something that can happen, but in the Geula state of mind, we would perceive dreams and we'd understand what that missing piece is. Because dreams are kind of like a glimpse back into what it's like to be one, to have oneness, and there's no
back to,
possibility
like,
of.
God Eden.
Okay.
It's everything we're talking about here is paradoxical. Any statement that I should have made should have contradicted itself, because dreaming in Gullus is looking back into, peering back into Gan Eden, when there was this primal unity, almost this oneness, of everything being kind of nullified to the will of God. But that's happening. If that's happening in Gullus, then that's Geula. No, because in Gullus there's a concealment of God's light. Our goal is to reveal it. How does it become revealed? We now become the vessels to reveal it, because in Gullus, which is shame, which is compared to sleeping, dreaming, our avoda, our will, our yesh, our existence, can now take on divine implications, can now take on basically become God's will in this world and reveal God. When we do whatever, learn Torah, mitzvos, hula, and all other positive things. But in a Geula mind, that can't happen. Geula doesn't mean like I plant my Adam Friedman's flag in the ground. Geula means I snap my flag and I return to God.
It dissolved into thin air.
Gullus is when I plant my flag into the earth.
And it says your name on it.
It says my name on one side and God's name on the other side. And that's able to exist in this world, in Gullus only. And that's why it's a lot more pleasurable to God for that to happen, because we were created for that purpose. That's the fullest, highest manifestation of his of what he went into creation for.
So will there be oneness in Google time?
I think, yeah.
Seemingly.
That's what you're saying, but I thought you also said that the only time when there was real oneness was before the world.
Yeah, so even creation is already a step removed from the actual oneness. Yeah, you're right. So, redemption, I think, is going to be a complete revelation of like the will of God. Gemara is the answer.
But because
Well, it's Hen Galti Eschem Acharis Kirishis.
right.
It's like
So
come back.
so yeah, everything
like
is.
it was in the beginning one, and now
We're
sort of
this
not.
is-
and
we're
now-
getting to
the
it.
greatest
Let's just read
wonder
the
of
next.
the world.
Let's read the next piece because I think that will help us.
Like just human connectivity of oneness is like a crazy.
Yeah, I mean,
That's just like all concepts of Gula are like the most far out. Just like all walks of Jew are gonna participate in the same place of ritual service. The most far out thing I could ever imagine in my entire life.
and when you're in Gullus mindset, not Gullus as we're learning Gullus, but when you're in Gullus, you can't. That is the biggest contradiction you can ever think of, because you're like, no way in hell am I going with that guy. But Gullus is not that. That's like that's. There should be another word for it, because Gullus is this. Whatever that is, whatever that world is, that existence that people decide to live their life terribly by, then that's like the exile that people fret over. And not saying that exile is a good thing. It's not. And it's not the point like the Rebbe Yatz was making, and it's not the point I'm making. But the way we're trying to understand exile here in Gullus is it allows for that to happen for myriads of Jews to be one. That's why, all the Jews who left Mitzrayim, that was the first one, they were different. I mean, even though they were all in Gullus, everyone was their own person. They all had their different, whatever. This guy probably got favored by this guard, and this guy probably got it harder. But redemption was 60,000 Jewish souls, individuals, 600,000 leaving Mitzrayim. Because she would allow them to allow them to come together before the revelations of the Yam Suf. Being in Gullus allowed them to actually be redeemed, because it allowed them to come together. You see how necessary Gullus is then, and that's what this birrurim is. Gullus is needed. The chalom of Gullus, the living the reality existence. And in the Avodas Halevi continues to say, he's not saying that like we're in a slumber, we're in a sleep, but he's comparing Gullus to sleep in the sense, and I don't know if I made that clear. It's not to say we've been asleep since creation, and like we're gonna wake up. We kind of will, but we're gonna wake up and like we've been, and at the end of the twist of the movie is that it never really happened. It was only but a dream. It's Nelly. So let's read the next.
That is Nelly.
Let's read the next source, because that's Shir Malos B'Shu Hashem Ashivat Tzion Ayin V'Kachon. This is from Torah. So we say in Shir Malos, and we say it when we bench, and when we're redeemed, when we come back to Zion, we're going to be like dreamers. We're going to be like dreamers. We're going to look back on the exile as dreamers. And this piece really stresses the importance of like what we do at the U, because in order to learn a piece, for this piece to come to the world and then us to learn it here, we have the ability to like kind of have the hindsight that he's talking about a little earlier. So we're going to look like dreamers. Why? Because hine hachalom mechaber shnei hafachim benosei echad umarchiv shnei inyanim hafachim kilu hayu lachadim v'henu mipnei ki b'sheina nistalik moach haseichel hamavchin v'lo nishar rak kochem adam. So when a person goes to sleep, opposites attract. They exist fine together, and because the discerning intellect is removed, and what remains is the imagination. וכוח המדמה יכול להרחיב באיזה עניונים הפכים כמו ספינה רצה באוויר, כמו שכתוב הרמב"ם משמונה פרקים, רק שבהקיץ, when a person wakes up, שמסעורר כוח השכל, and awakens his intellect, הוא השולי על כוח המדמה, which rules over our מדמה, our imagination, ואינו מניחו להרחיב לפי שרואה באין שכלו שהן דברים נפרדים, ואינו מסעקתם fine. It tells us these things, these are opposites. There's no way they could be together. Nekach, ha'inyan, begolus, nitzot zelokus, and golus, when a spark of godliness is in the benefesh adam, is in the soul of man, shu b'china shena, it's in the realm of sleep. It exists, that chelek eloka mimal that is in the guf exists in the realm of sleep, the stalkus hamochin, and the removal of the intellect. The removal of my ability to say, these can't be together, and these two can't go together, and this can't happen together. That's gone. Yachol hu laharchid beis levar mafachim yos kol hayom tarid
Asav matan.
masav matan ish levitzel mekatzeu zapona lezesa. A person can be involved in business and serve God. Bottom line, that's what I said. They're not. If we lived an existence of not being asleep, quote unquote, of not being gullus sheina cholom, then we would say, okay, I have to make a living, and there's no time for God. But as the Mashriach pointed out this week, the big part of the biggest revelation of the Baal Shem Tov was that of all the things that he revealed, was that this you can. Everything you do in the world and everything you feel and express and think in the world is really a manifestation of that emotion for God. So you work hard, just to use the example he's using. In some way, this is birrurim, figuring out what that is. In some way, that's a godly move on your part to work hard in your job. Your avoda is now to make the beer of how. How is it that way? But it is that way. That's the reality. In Galus. And before that, only those who learned were the ones who served God.
Cooper.
Yeah. I wouldn't have been there. This wouldn't have happened. Beer wouldn't have been drunk.
Beer.
Could be that should be what you do in Chabura. I'll take a beer, I'll have beer.
Skiing?
And then the rest of the piece he goes into just his bonus and dveikus and tefillah and just different things. But the main point of that thing is we'll be like dreamers in the sense that we'll look back on Gullus and we'll say, that and that, they weren't opposites. They were working in tandem together. This and this. And in Gullus, everyone will have whatever. I don't know how Gulo really works. But we'll look back. Everyone will look back as dreamers and say, these things went together. My contradictory life of jerk and servant of God are one, But we have now we sat through this and we're here, at least try to be every week. We should involve ourselves in that birrurim of trying to figure out, hayinu kechomim now. Trying to look back on my life previously and constantly is okay, if they seem opposite, let's figure out how they're not. And sometimes in Gullus, it has to, in order to move forward in life, you have to choose one thing over the other. But to always know that whatever you're choosing, that's you're doing God's will. You're doing it. It's happening, whether you like it or not. And he just continues the piece, the next page. והנה גם אחרי הדבר והאמס האלה לא יופל לב האדם עליו לומר כי הסורי שבתפילה בזבונוס הם דמיונו שווה שהוא כמו החלום שהוא כוח המדמה. This is amazing what he said. כי הנה מאחר שרוב בנפשו אחר תפילה שחולפת סובר עץ העבר להשם ומסהפך להבס גופו דווקא הרי מובן שגם בתפילה לא ביטל הבס גופו מכל וכל וסעור שבתפילה העבר להשם לבדה אינו אמיתס רק כדמיון החלום. So he says, even your love that you have for God, that you think, oh, I'm like totally loving God right now. Yeah, we're in a dream right now. We're in a dream reality, you know. And it's kind of like that's fine, because that's just how it is. But the thing that you need to know underneath it all is that when you love your body, when you love your soul, it's the same love. It's the same love of God. The same trying to do God's will in this world and reveal God here. It's the same thing. So when we look at it as different things, that we're living like tremendous exile, and we're not living the exile that's needed in order to be redeemed. And we'll just sum it up with a piece from Rav Kook, all of Cook is good. So he says in Pulas Hashena, what's the function of sleep? Hashena b'chol tchunas hativis haklali shel leila shehi gormus as Hashena mazamis poeles al tzadei hachayim shebanim shetei pulos hafochis. Two opposite things are happening when you sleep. Atzada elyon, you're lofty, haruchani, yucholas alos yozer can now go to the highest highs. Chovshi nasa hadimyon, your imagination's free, mazgar achushim, it's free from like the feelings of your body. The imhu tamid mekusher b'seichel l'chevet elyon kadosh, and it's totally connected to holiness. Yuchol l'tzayir l'dumus, so therefore it's able to paint, and it's able to create, and it's able to imagine. Lachazosu lahaker mash em be'yacholso b'zman ha'aros. You're like, impossible becomes nothing for you when you're in sleep. It is nothing. Aval koach hachayim shebaguf chadal kishuro im hatzara ruchani shabadam hu holech levada. The body goes dark. It just like throws its cell phone down and crushes it, and it's like, I'm going. Yeah, I'm going to enjoy myself, yo. Poelas pulasas hativis, and it just does what the animal nature is to do. B'tzura chushachas mirufeles, and it just goes dark. Goes Mishnei makomos midvekas dugmas. Oros tzachos v'neshama elyona miziv shalamala umechshakim v'tzech sochi zuhama v'klipos ma'avivos v'nefesh achayim. Last paragraph. V'harinu ponim b'chol bakar l'shtei avodos l'taris ha'nefesh achayim l'kashas ha'oros ha'nosafim v'neshama ha'adam elyona v'chaber odapam eshtei ha'kitzos b'harmonia and so on. To bring my coarse, dark, disgusting body and my lofty, holy, exalted, light-filled soul together, and to have each one teach the other, and to do something of a unity. So that's pretty much. I mean, the rest is just he's kind of like saying the same notion that dreaming and sleep allows for the highest high of me and the lowest low of me to like meet and like do a little dance and impart knowledge onto one another. You know, the soul from the loftiest and the body, whatever it finds from down there. They come together and they share stories and they share highlights, and they come together, and the imagination and the intellect come together, and ultimately, Mashvia said he said the Chassidish of Taich on Vayomer Elokim Yehior. You know, it's like Vayomer. Elokim, what was it? Vayomer, a person should say. Elokim Yehior. Yehi or. Right after it says like the world was filled with choshech, so God said it, right? But the way that the Jew says, Vayomer, a Jew says, Elokim, Yehi or, and God just makes light happen. So when I was singing, because I was like preparing the Chabura, and he said that, I was like, perhaps there's a deeper interpretation, a neo-Hasidic interpretation, of it's coming right after it says the choshech al pnei tehom. So, Vayomer, a person says to God, Elokim, God, Yehi or, that's light. Points to the darkness and says that's light. And God says, you're right, that's light. Because ultimately, avodas ha-birrurim makes us unify the light and the dark. And as the Rebbe said, a little bit of light expels a whole lot of darkness. So when the light and the dark come together, obviously the light's going to win out. And that ultimately will bring us within Golos to personal and then ultimately collective redemption, and tie it back into Noah. Specifically when Noah was a mamin and an eno mamin, when Noah was at the level of, I believe, I'm a believer, and an atheist, and a not believer. Specifically at that point, when he was on both ends of the spectrum, he entered the Teva. And he surrounded himself with the Teva, with the makif of God's light, where those two things can exist together. Those two realities of, God, I believe in you so much, and God, I'm sorry, I just really want to do this, and those things can exist in tandem, and that's not an advocation for sin, but ultimately, this is the world we live in, and for 1 second we should never think that if I'm caught up in something bad, or even if I'm just feeling bad, that this is the way I have to feel, because it was specifically at that point when Noach was going through a serious agmas nefesh of, he just went onto the table and just chose a way, and that ultimately saved his life. And we should learn from Noach and board floating ships from here on out.
That fly.
In dreams.
Good.
Chaim.
Awesome.